My name is Dilakshan and I'm going to look at has homelessness increased in recent years. I'm going to be seeing how people are being affected by homelessness. And I want to see what's actually being done by the council to prevent this. I'm also going to see what the public think of the homeless as well. Homelessness in London is on the rise rapidly, with the number of people sleeping rough. It's been rising every year since 2010. The increase is due to the cutting from the government and lack of housing because of the high rise of price of living in London. The increase in migration is also a key factor to the problem. How is it that we see rich parts of London but we still see loads of homeless people? Imagine while we are in a cozy home, there are people out there sleeping rough in cold nights.
Yes.
Yes, of course. I mean, certainly over the past few years, there seems to be more and more homeless people on the streets, and it's difficult because you want to help, but you can't help all of them, so it becomes a little bit stressful sometimes.
It depends because as I see it nowadays, when you give money to a homeless person, they'll go and buy, things like drugs, alcohol or cigarettes. And I believe with the money you give them, they should at least, spend it on themselves, help them, like either buying themselves food.
Yes, I try, but again, you feel a bit helpless because there's so many.
Well, my first impression when I see a homeless person is some might seem friendly, some may seem innocent, and some may seem aggressive. But at the end of the day, we're not in their shoes to understand their situation because most of them are depressed of the way they're living and that they can't really do anything about the way their situation is.
But my first thought is that I hope that there's people helping them.
Yes, I believe the council should help out homeless people out there because they're out there where it's coldest nights, they haven't got any food, they haven't got any shelter, they haven't got anything that helps them live. Whereas us, we're living in a different kind of situation where we've got a home, we're living where it's warm and we've got food and we're safe, and that is something they don't really have. And I feel like the council should at least provide them with homes with cheap rent to start off with. And then as time goes, maybe at least increase the rent a bit.
Yes, of course. I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons why people become homeless. And some of them are because of mental illness, for instance, or addiction, where they're not getting the help that they need. And so they've lost control of things like their finances and whatnot. And that's how they've ended up homeless. So there's lots of ways that the council and the government could be helping to reduce the amount of homeless people.
Not all homeless people do that. I mean, most of them are different. Most of them actually want to go and buy food for themselves, or keep them going through the day?
No, I mean obviously everybody's different. I'm sure some do, but many don't. It's a person by person thing. My job, I run this charity shop, which is for shelter. We raise money. Primarily, shelter's main mission is to prevent homelessness in the first place. So we help people who are in housing crisis, who are about to lose their homes, or who are being treated unfairly by their landlords, or living in conditions which are unbearable. And we offer legal assistance, and we also offer a caseworker to help them get the best possible help that's available, to try and stop them becoming homeless if possible in the first place.
So let's find out what the council does to help homelessness and how they try to prevent homelessness in London.
My job is the head of the Housing Needs Service at Brent Council, and what that involves is I'm responsible for 3 operational teams that deal with the applications from homeless families and single homeless people, and we try and prevent homelessness, and if we can't prevent homelessness, then we provide accommodation for those homeless households. Homelessness is definitely increasing, not just in Brent but across the whole country, particularly in London. The main driver for homelessness is the affordability gap. So in London, the costs of housing is astronomical, and therefore most households can't afford to buy a property in London. So the knock-on effect of that is that the majority of households are dependent on the private rented sector, and so that has meant that there is an insufficient supply of private rented properties to meet the demand, and therefore the cost of privately renting in London has gone through the roof. So it's extremely expensive to privately rent in London. So the consequence of that is that the families who are either dependent on benefits or who are on a low income cannot afford to live in the majority of the private rented properties that are in London. So the only other accommodation that's available is social housing, which is the housing provided by the council and by housing associations. Unfortunately, there is an insufficient supply of that accommodation as well. So the consequence of that is that a lot of families and single people are now being evicted by their private sector landlord through no fault of their own. It's just that the landlord knows that he can charge a much higher rent to a family who are working and who are earning a high income, rather than the lower rents that he will be able to charge a family on low income or who are dependent on benefits. And so the families are being evicted. They can't find alternative private rented accommodation which they can afford to rent, and so they become homeless, and that's when they present to the local authority. The other reason that homelessness has increased in the last 12 months is the introduction of the Homelessness Reduction Act, which came into force in April 2018. And what the Homelessness Reduction Act did was it placed a new statutory duty on the local authority to prevent and relieve homelessness for everyone. And what I mean by that is that before the Homelessness Reduction Act was enacted, if you were a single homeless person and you were homeless, if you weren't vulnerable enough to trigger the statutory duty, then the local authority didn't have a duty to accommodate you, and we would just give advice and assistance to try and help you. What the Homelessness Reduction Act has done is it's imposed a new duty on the local authority to actually work with you to prevent your homelessness if that's possible, and if that's not possible, then to relieve your homelessness. And that means to try and help you find alternative accommodation to stop you from being homeless. So since the implementation of the Homelessness Reduction Act in Brent, we've seen a 57% increase in the demand from homeless households. If the person is under 18, then the Children's Social Services will take the lead on helping that young person under the Children Act. So there are duties under the Children Act to accommodate any young person under the age of 18. If they're over the age of 18, then the council has a dedicated service for single homeless people. So we would interview that person to determine what their vulnerabilities may be beyond the fact that they are a young person. I mean, just being 18 or 19 and being homeless is vulnerable enough, but you may find quite often that there are other vulnerabilities around substance misuse or mental health issues, and therefore there will be a different pathway depending on the young person's needs. So at the very lower end of the spectrum, if the person was just a young person and there were no other vulnerabilities, then we would work with them to secure alternative accommodation, which would probably be in the private rented sector. And if necessary, we could provide what's called floating support, where a support worker could go in and visit the person maybe once a week or once a fortnight, just to make sure that they were coping and they were managing their rent account correctly, and that they were okay. If the vulnerability was greater than that, in as much as there was an underlying mental health issue, for instance, then there are specialist services like supported housing services, and there's an organisation called DePaul who specialise in working with young homeless people. However, in my opinion, the best place for young people is to be back at home. So our main goal here, if it's appropriate, in other words, if there is no abuse at home, then we would work with the family to try and reconcile any relationship so that the young person was able to go home and live with their parents or their family member. So our primary objective here is to try and prevent the homelessness in the first place, and if the person has already left the home, so to try and reconcile the relationship so that they can return to a safe environment. However, there are some cases where it isn't appropriate for the young person to return home, and therefore we would find the appropriate pathway either through the private rented sector or supported housing or ultimately social housing to prevent or stop that young person from being homeless. The council is working very hard to prevent homelessness in the first instance, and as previously mentioned, this is now a statutory requirement under the Homelessness Reduction Act. So we do a lot of work to encourage families and single people to approach us as soon as they suspect that they are at risk of homelessness. In other words, we don't want people to approach us at the point of crisis when they are either already homeless or they're about to become homeless the next day. So the main two reasons for homelessness in Brent and indeed across the country are the evictions from the private rented sector and by parents or family excluding people. So in both of those cases, if a person knows that their landlord is going to evict them, and to do so they must go through a court process which involves serving at least 2 months' notice and then going to court to obtain a possession order, and then ultimately going back to the court to obtain a bailiff's warrant to enforce that order. So that household would have at least 4 or 5 months notice before they became actually homeless. So what the council is doing is encouraging those families or single people to come to us at the very, very earliest stage where they have just been served with notice. And what we are able to do then is contact the landlord to find out why he wants possession of the property. Now, it could be that there's an issue with rent, the rent's not being paid on time, or there could be an issue with the tenant causing some sort of nuisance. And then we're able to mediate, we're able to talk to the tenant about not causing nuisance, or if there is an issue with the housing benefit claim or universal credit, then again we are able to intervene to try and stop the rent arrears from accruing, and in some cases we can negotiate with the landlord to pay off some of the arrears to prevent the homelessness. Equally with the parental or family exclusion, again we would ask the people to come to us as early as possible so that we can intervene at an earlier stage and mediate with the family member to find out what is the root cause of the exclusion. Is it down to behaviour? Is it down to overcrowding? And we will work with the family to either reconcile the relationship and keep the household member at home, or if we acknowledge that perhaps the property is too overcrowded and the person does have to leave, then we would want to arrange a planned exit. And by that, what I mean is we would find somewhere else for that person to live, so that they weren't being excluded onto the streets. They would go from the family home into the alternative accommodation. The other thing the council's doing to try and prevent homelessness is increased supply, because the biggest problem in London is the gulf between the demand for affordable accommodation and the supply of affordable accommodation. So the council is working to build our own properties, and we are also working with the housing associations in our borough to help develop new supply of accommodation. Unfortunately, because it's London, the land just simply isn't there to build en masse. There is some land that we've got within our own council estates or that the housing associations acquire, but unfortunately the majority of the land, for instance around Wembley, there's been a lot of redevelopment around Wembley, but the majority of it is for privately owned properties which will not be affordable for the majority of the households who we deal with in Brent, who are on low incomes. So other things that we're doing is we've created our own company, and we are actually buying properties on the open market so that we can use those properties for homeless families. So we have a whole strategy around prevention of homelessness in the first place, and another strategy around increasing the supply of affordable accommodation to meet the demand from the households in Brent. So the funding that the council receives, it's complex. So the money that we receive from central government, we get for the prevention side of things. So what we're trying to do is use that money on initiatives to help negotiate with landlords. But the biggest factor in all of this is the supply of accommodation. So we do get money from government which we can use to help to develop and build new supply of accommodation, but it is still a major issue in our borough. If you see a rough sleeper, someone sleeping on the streets, then there is an organisation called StreetLink. So if you just Google StreetLink, and that is an organisation who you can report where you saw the person sleeping rough and what time of day you saw them, and give a brief description of what they look like. What StreetLink will do then is we commission a service through St Mungo's, who are a homelessness charity, and St Mungo's operates an outreach service for Brent Council, whereby they go out onto the streets during the night and they engage with these rough sleepers to try and get them off the streets, because we have got hostels that are available for rough sleepers. So if you do see someone sleeping rough, then please contact StreetLink, give them the information. They will then make a referral to our outreach service, who will then be able to go out and meet the person on the streets and talk to them about why they're sleeping rough, what their needs are, and basically help them to get off the streets.
There is homeless service cuts to the charities that are helping the homeless people. The homeless people are vulnerable people who have no friends, no family, no one to give the support they need. Many people tend to overlook the homeless people, the ones that are in need. If I see a homeless person on the street, I'd feel bad and I'll try my best to help them out. But most people ignore them as if they aren't there. After interviewing the council, I realized I shouldn't donate to homeless people directly, as all the help that is needed is provided by the council and charities. There are all homeless shelters where they can stay and get food, which are donated by people, and they can get help from alcohol or drug counselors if needed. They can also have shower, and they can also get food and clothes that are donated too. They also have advice on benefits and housing. What I also learned is that the council is doing its best to help the homeless, but the current funds by the government isn't enough to help every homeless person. And another problem is immigration, which is increasing rapidly, and the council is finding it hard to place people within their local boroughs, which can affect families as they would need to move for schools for the children.